If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What is the absolute creepiest and scariest true encounter you've had with something or someone that still bothers you to this day? We used to take an old back road that would take us to town, where I lived a while ago. It was a 20 to 30 minute drive. It was an old stretch of road that was an old worn road that went through a stretch of trees, a small burst of houses, and was surrounded by farmland and fields, so it was a very rural area. There is a train track that cuts through and an unkept road that goes off to the side on the right. One evening we went down the road, and there was a car, I want to say an old Honda? I couldn't tell, that was parked off on that little road to the side. I saw them and thought, odd, because the road led nowhere, it just stopped a few feet away. We came back much later in the day, night had fallen, and the car was still sitting there. A few days later, we find that the car had been linked to a murder. Apparently, the car belonged to a woman who had been missing. It was her boyfriend and left her in a shallow grave. The car he abandoned was left there while her child was at school. This happened to me a couple of years ago. My uncle owns a few acres of land in Texas in a big forest, I don't want to say exactly where, and me and my family fly out there every summer for a week or so. So me and my two cousins, who were 17 and 18 at the time, I was 16, are just walking around this small trail that goes along my uncle's property, not too far from the house, shooting the SHT and talking about whatever. It was the afternoon, still bright out. At one point, we all saw this guy to our left. Seeing people out there wasn't too uncommon, as there are sometimes hunters or my uncle's neighbors around. But we were still on my uncle's land, and usually they don't come this close to the house. So we see this dude, and we're immediately creeped out by him. He doesn't see us, and we crouch down by these two big trees. This guy has no clothes on whatsoever, and his skin is like this dark grayish-bluish color. He just wanders around aimlessly for a while, almost like he was just mindless. Slowly walking around this small area, not really looking at or going anywhere in particular. We're just creeped out by him and don't know what to do, so we keep watching. Eventually, he wanders closer to us, and we get a better look at him through the trees and vegetation. And the guy's legs are backwards. Like the hind legs of a cat. His knees are on the wrong side. We all see this at the same time and kind of gasp and jump up, and I guess he hears us. He looks at us, and I don't know how to explain his face. It's blurry. Kind of like when you first wake up in the morning. You can't look directly at it for some reason. We all noticed this when we talked after. So anyway, the thing sees us, and it seems like it's just as scared of us as we are of it. It starts to frantically back up in the opposite direction of us, and we do the same. At one point, we both stop and just stare at each other. It lurches forward, almost like it's about to cough something up or puke, and lets out this weird, loud croaking noise. Kind of like a frog, but more human. After that, the three of us just turned and bolted out of there, running right back to the house. We told all of our family, but they all either thought we were making it up or were mistaken. But we all swear to this day that we saw this. And we all agreed on what it looked like. Just ducking weird. I was probably 16 or so, driving with friends to run an errand deep in the Finger Lakes region of WNY. We drove well over an hour into nowhere and eventually turned off the main road onto a dirt/gravel road that led into the woods. After about 10 minutes on the gravel road, a beat-to-shit cabin appeared in a small clearing. The person driving warned the rest of us to stay in the car and not make too much noise. She got out, and three men stepped out onto the porch, one tall and thin, one short with a long gray beard, and one average height with his entire jaw missing. They were very aware of our presence, and the third man stayed on the porch, staring at us as she stepped inside the cabin with the other two. She came back out after a few minutes, got in the car, said, "Wait till we're on the road," and peeled the duck out of there, all the while they watched. It turns out we were, in fact, buying meth, yikes, and his jaw was missing from a failed endgame attempt. I still feel for him and their undoubtedly painful existence, but I get chills whenever I remember they're probably still out there somewhere in the Finger Lakes. We live in Florida and raise cattle. One day, a calf died. I have no idea why. When we found it, it was lying along the fence that separates the pasture from some woods and a creek. It was a healthy calf, it probably weighed 250 to 300 pounds. It had been fine the day before, but the vultures had been at it, so we couldn't tell how it had died. We went back the next day to bury it, but it was gone. We could see where it had been dragged under the barbed wire fence and into the woods. We hopped the fence and followed the drag marks, thinking that maybe coyotes had been at it. However, the marks disappeared, and then, maybe 20 feet away, the ground was disturbed where the calf had been put down and dragged a bit, and then the drag marks disappeared. This went on for a while, Until we found the calf skin. That was all that was left. Something carried an animal that weighed at least 200 pounds through the woods. We're not really trackers, and the pine needles and leaves on the ground didn't leave any clear prints. Just the drag marks. We're a couple of 100 feet in the woods, looking down at this calf skin on the ground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got goosebumps. I was nearly overwhelmed by the need to get the hell out of there. We didn't run back, but we did walk really fast. I still don't know what took our calf. The next day, something spooked the cows so much that they nearly stampeded through our working pen, knocking down and trampling some of the panels. No idea. I was on my first real date with my now husband. Backpacking up by Mount St. Helens. We stayed over at this little shelter called Bolt Camp, which is about 5 to 6 miles off the beaten path. You can Google it. You'll see some pictures of it with a down tree that took out part of the shelter. That is the way it was when we stayed there. It's a beautiful hike. The sun was setting as we were nearing the camp. Most of it is a dirt path, but there are a number of places where there are little wooden bridges. Every time we'd cross one, we'd say, "Watch out for trolls." Many of the trees had hollows at their bases, and as the sun went down, it would shine through them, creating the illusion that they were little hobbits or fairy houses with tiny fires burning at tiny hearths. As it got dark, we started seeing phosphorescent mushrooms glowing an eerie green. It's a really neat little shelter. Dirt floor, but probably big enough for 6 people to sleep in, sans the down tree. I think it has been rebuilt since. The last people left a half bottle of scotch behind, which we partook of. When we left some weed and a few bottles of water behind. Kind of a take something leave something little place. Anyway, we went to sleep in the shelter. He was towards the entrance, and I was towards the back. I woke up at some point. It was pitch black, of course. I was facing towards the back of the shelter when I saw it. It's hard to describe. It looked like a spider web floating through the back of the shelter. Sort of geometric shaped, floating around, changing shapes, and sort of flipping over and swapping end to end. I wasn't afraid of it. In fact, I really enjoyed watching it. I'm an atheist and don't believe in ghosts, but I laid there thinking that it must have been some kind of spirit. I wanted to wake him up so he could see it too, but I didn't know him that well and figured he'd think I was crazy or wouldn't be able to see it. Anyway, I watched it for a few minutes, then drifted back to sleep. A couple of months later, we were talking about our trip, and I finally told him about it. His mouth dropped open. Apparently, the very next night after we returned, he was outside of his house having a smoke when he saw a thing that matched that description exactly, floating and drifting along. It finally sort of puffed out of existence in front of a bush. In their place were glowing red eyes. It did freak him out, so he nodded back into the house. We've never seen it again. I remember one story I heard a few times as a kid about the woods around my hometown. I still have no idea if it actually happened. As with all these stories, every kid in town claims to have knowledge about it. The story goes that a bunch of kids, ages 8 to 12, were running around some of the woods and stumbled upon a hole in the ground that had been dug recently. The younger kids thought this was great because they could use it to play around in and whatnot. But one of the older kids realized that what they had actually found was a pre-dug grave. Supposedly, it was about 1 meter wide, 2 meters long, and 1 meter deep as well. Kids run home to tell their parents, who in turn tell the local policeman, who gets the kids to lead them to it. Cop agrees that this is suspicious but doesn't have the resources to stake it out 24/7. Instead, he chooses to leave it as is and come back every day to check. Nothing happens for a while, until one day the cop checks and finds the hole filled in. He brings in a forensics unit, and they recover the remains of a young woman known to the policeman, who immediately races to the home of the woman to find out what happened. When he and the other cops get there, they find the husband in the middle of disposing of incriminating evidence. Several years ago, on a bright winter afternoon, I decided to take my nephew, 7, my son, 3, and my dog on a short hike at a local park. We were walking through the woods on a trail when my dog started barking. I look over and see a man standing in the woods, about 50 feet away, facing us. I couldn't see his face because he had one of those fur-lined hoods on, so with the distance and the shadows from the trees and his hood, from my perspective, there was nothing but a black hole where his face should be. I gave an awkward wave, but he remained motionless, and I had a weird feeling, so I decided to just keep moving and make our way back to the car. I felt like we were being watched, so I looked back a few minutes later, and the man was still just standing in the woods, but I knew he had moved because he was still about 50 feet away and we had walked quite a distance. My dog was growling, and the kids and I were starting to get creeped out. We keep moving, and I suddenly hear the sound of fast, heavy footsteps in the snow. I looked back again, and this time I caught the guy running in our direction. but he stopped as soon as I saw him and went back to just staring motionlessly from afar, now closer than he was before. My dog was going nuts at this point, and my mind was racing with possibilities, so I discreetly gave my nephew my phone and quietly told him that if anything happened, he needed to take his cousin and run as fast as they could to the car and call for help. I figured, if anything, the dog and I could at least hold the guy off long enough for the kids to get away. I think my dog may have scared him off because he ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction. I've never really told anyone because I don't want to come off as being dramatic. Not the creepiest thing that happened, but up there. I was in the barn milking as dusk was setting, and I was walking back into the barn when the dogs started to bark. I walked back out of the barn to see them, and they started running to a dark SUV, which wasn't there 2 seconds before, running with its lights on in front of the barns. I wondered how in the hell the car drove up my driveway without me or the dogs hearing it. I had just been out there. As they ran to the car, ready to jump on the side and greet somebody, it just vanished. One dog jumped up to put its paws on the side of the car and fell down as the car just disappeared. The dogs ran around where they had been sitting and looked at me, confused. I stood there just as confused for a moment. The dogs were unsettled. I said to them, "Well, that was a blip in the matrix," and walked back into the barn. There were no tire tracks left or any sign that it was there. If the dogs hadn't run around in circles in the place they had been, I would have thought I had been seeing things. I tried telling a few people after that, but they looked at me like I was crazy. I have seen some odder things here and wonder why. I believe after what I have seen that either none of this is real, this life, or that other dimensions cross into our lives at times. I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin and live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there for 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. I never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. It was hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking in my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Someone or something was waiting for me and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, steps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me but also to my younger brother, who visited, and to friends. And it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there, around the cabin. Here is the funny thing, I was never afraid or felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodland around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I came across evidence of recent campsites in the woods. Traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in. Garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard, with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, and even a weasel one day. Like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them. This went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog, who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect point position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger, larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It was not funny. The final 2 gifts were legs from either horses or cows. Big and bloody, one was skinned, holy SHT. The second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods, howling on a trail, following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. She came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as soon as she came. I moved back to the Maryland suburbs of DC, got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not long after I picked up the Washington Post, there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall, Yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland, was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way. Country folks. I think the monster was an escaped patient or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless people you see in cities now. Probably off his medications, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt. The camps in the woods could have been him. There was nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me but sensed I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I do not think he could have survived until the 1980s. The deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill die. When I was 15 or 16, I was homeschooled and took my classes online, so I was home alone most days until people got back in the evenings. One morning I went on a run, and I got this feeling like I was being watched when I got into our neighborhood, so I was a little on edge and went back into my house ASAP. A few hours later, after working on a paper, I went downstairs to get a snack and noticed that one of the bushes in the forest on the other side of our backyard fence, we lived in a rural town, suddenly shook around a lot. We had a lot of bobcats, coyotes, etc. in the area, so I wrote it off as one of those at first, but when I got back upstairs, I looked down at the spot from my bedroom window and saw the top of a man's head. I almost again wrote it off as some sort of animal until I noticed some skin and what appeared to be a jacket collar, and I immediately freaked out and went to get the phone to call my mom. The creepy thing was that since I got back from my run, I went outside to use our hot tub, and because we didn't have people directly behind our house, I didn't close the blinds when I changed. Whoever the dude was, he was probably there watching the whole time, and I was just really creeped out at the thought of that. My mom did some asking around, and while no one else said they ever saw anyone creeping around the woods around that time, someone did say there was a strange man in the area who was sometimes seen talking to teenage boys coming home from school and would often make them feel uncomfortable. We lived near the high school. After this, I always kept my blinds closed, rarely used the hot tub if there wasn't a neighbor outside, and looked over my shoulder a little more when I went on runs. The church that my family attends does this thing every few years or so where the youth hike a certain amount of miles, usually 20 within the span of a couple days. We had to dress in pioneer clothes and pull wagons in the summer heat. Everything was fine the first night since we were all tired, but the second night we had gotten used to the walking and all the weight we had to pull, so when it came time for bed, my friend and I weren't tired. We had all set up these tents that were on top of this loud plastic tarp. That night, my friend and I left our tent to watch the stars and see how many shooting stars we could count. We were talking, and there were a couple horses and a few leaders on the road that weren't far from us. There was this thing running around in circles around us, and since it was so dark, we assumed it was a horse. Eventually we had changed positions so that we could see a little bit, thanks to the moon, and I was talking about something when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. About 15 feet away from us was another tent, but there was a shadow that ducked down as soon as I saw it. I had paused, and my friend had asked, "Did you see that too?" There was silence, and then we both jumped up, grabbed our blankets, and ran back to our tent. Whatever we saw was large and clearly ducking down so that it was hidden from the tent. These tents were about 10 feet tall. We knew it wasn't someone since the tallest person was about 6 feet 4 inches, and the tent still had height on him. Plus, we never heard the tarp rustle if someone had gotten up and just so happened to be taller than the tent. We stumbled back to our tent and tied it shut in a hurry, and soon we heard it run in our direction, stop outside our tent, and stay there, waiting for us to come back out. We held our breath out of fear and ended up passing out. No one believed what we saw and said it was just a leader or another youth. Whatever we saw out there, we know it ran in circles around us for a bit and watched us for, God knows, how long. It also had a weird football-shaped head and insanely large arms. I'm relaying my father's story. It's not supernatural or anything, but it's creepy as shit to me. My dad used to frequently take his camper down to WV and camp along the, I believe, Dry Fork River. It's fairly secluded, and about, I'd say, 25 to 30 minutes from an actual town, and it's sort of out there, as is most things in West Virginia. You have to take a bunch of windy roads and eventually a dirt road to get there. Occasionally, one or two other people might inhabit the campsites that are along this road that runs besides the Dry Fork. Anyways, he's out there alone with his camper one night, and down the road, a bunch of people pull up and build a fire, play loud music, and probably get drunk. Nothing abnormal, really. I've experienced this many times myself. This is whatever to him, and they carry on with this as he goes into his camper and falls asleep. He's by himself, which my dad frequently does. Flash forward to the middle of the night, he wakes up to someone knocking on the door of his camper. It's pitch black out, and the people down the road have either left or gone to bed themselves. As he said, it was completely silent out. Since he estimated that it had to be at least 2 to 3 a.m., this just freaks my dad out, and he grabs his shotgun, and, as he told me the story, he yells, "Who's there?" authoritatively as he's looking out the window in an attempt to see who's there. He apparently can't see anyone or anything outside because it's absolute darkness out. In reply, some woman replies back and says that she's stranded out there and is hoping my dad will give her a ride back to town. My dad, who at this point is sweating bullets and just frozen in place, asks her why she's out there, and she replies that she and her baby came out with some friends and they can't give her a ride home. She doesn't specify whether or not it was with the group who were being loud or not, but he guesses this is who she's referring to. What really puzzled my dad is the legitimacy of this story, because he doesn't know many people who take their babies out to get shit-faced in the middle of nowhere. It's possible, but, again, he's telling me that he can't see this person at all or whether she has a small child, and he's a little disturbed at this, so he replies back, "Lady, I don't know who you are. If your friends brought you here, you better go back up the road and tell your friends to take you back, because there's no way I'm doing it." She didn't reply, and he said he just stood there frozen in place for what felt like forever, trying to listen for her leaving or any movement, but he couldn't hear anything. Eventually he goes to bed and wakes up the next day, and they've already left, so he can't verify if the woman was with them or not. I also found it weird that she didn't mention the kid at first, and I remember asking my dad specifically whether she said this later, to which he said yes, she didn't mention having a baby at first. I used to live on an old farm where the farmhands' quarters had been converted into a rental apartment. We felt a strong and unwelcoming presence in the apartment at night, movements and such, but the most impressive experience was the horse ghost. After living there for some time, the owner renewed the old stables to be rented out for horses. Shortly after, 3 horses took residency there, and not long after we heard it for the first time. At around 8 p.m., we heard a horse walk into the courtyard. We both jumped up and ran out, believing a horse had gotten loose. I ran to the stables, and my ex ran out to look after the horse. When he rapidly pulled open the door to the stables, I saw 3 shocked horses looking at me with puzzled expressions. My ex hadn't seen anything either, so we shrugged and went back to bed. The day after, it happened again. This time, we ran to the windows and looked out from both sides. Nothing. Only the vaguely lit darkness. A couple of days went by before we heard it again, and we got used to it and accepted it as it was, the spirit of a horse coming to visit its friends. It kept happening at random through the time we lived there, but always around 8 p.m. Even our neighbor, who was a stern, non-spiritual believing mechanic, heard it and totally lost her mind when she found out we heard it too. A while later, we learned that the farm had burned down many years ago, and we assumed the poor horse had perished then. When suddenly new horses arrived, they found some new friends. When I was in college, in a not great area, I lived in a building where you had to briefly go outside after parking in the garage to access the locked door to the stairwell. There were 2 stairwells, one on either side of the, quite long, garage. The garage had one metal mesh door that lifted so you could drive in, but it was totally see-through. One night I'm getting home late and grabbing all my crap from my car after parking, and then I turned to see this massive dude, like 6 feet 6 inches or 6 feet 7 inches range, in a hat and trench coat, standing right up against the mesh garage door in the dead center and staring straight at me. I'm in the garage, he is outside, but he is directly in the path to the locked stairwell. I don't want to show fear, so I take my time assembling all my stuff, and several minutes later I turn around, and he has not moved, still silently staring. I walk over to the bank of mailboxes, which is out of his line of sight, to form a plan. I wait another few minutes, and I can hear him breathing. Then I got my key ready and took off, running to the other end of the garage to get to the locked stairwell on that side. Dear reader, I was just about to shit myself when I heard heavy footsteps come pounding around the side of the building to the stairwell I was aiming for. Thank heavens, I was able to unlock the door quickly, bust in, and slam it behind me. I never saw him again, but it was clear he figured out my plan and knew where the other stairwell was. I still get chills to this day when I think about what could have happened. When I was about 10 to 12 years old, I was afraid of the dark and had trouble sleeping. I was always tired. Sometimes my mom came to my room at night just to check if I was sleeping. One night, I was just about to fall asleep when I saw my mom standing next to my window, looking out. Except it wasn't my mom, she had short hair, and this someone else had long hair. I didn't see their faces because it was dark, but when they turned around and looked at me, I felt horror I'd never felt before. Not because they were somehow horrible, but because I felt a wave of kindness and worry from them. I suddenly knew they had always been watching. Being a kid, I just hid under my blanket and waited. Nothing happened. And there was no one there when I finally checked. Well, I thought I was hallucinating from being so tired and half asleep, but it happened again. And again. Always different people. They were just checking on me, not wishing anything bad, but one of them was a bit irritated because I could see them. They said, not out loud, I just knew it in my head, that I shouldn't be staying in that room. They were like, it's obviously not good for you to spend a night on this route. I changed rooms with my sister later. Not for that reason. I never told a soul. I was not a trusting kid, and I was pretty sure everyone would think I was crazy. They never came to that other room. I started to sleep better. Sometimes, when I got up at night to have a glass of something, I felt this presence being like, see? I told you that was not a place for you. I swear that I'm a pretty serious person and do not believe in anything supernatural. But I have no explanation for this. I was trying to sleep on some kind of pathway for spirits, I guess. They didn't bother my sister. Or maybe she just didn't tell anyone either. I once dated a man who claimed he was haunted by a demon or evil spirit. Weird stuff would happen around him, like when he'd leave all the drawers and cabinet doors in his kitchen open. I'd come to his apartment and find all of them open, and him in his bedroom. When I'd ask about it, he'd say he didn't remember leaving them open. I thought he was just messing with me. Then I started to have nightmares when I'd stay over. I once dreamed a creature was hovering over him. It looked like a black sheet or like a dementor. It was trying to smother him, and I screamed myself awake. Once, when we were sitting in the living room, he said he felt it nearby, and I heard a guttural growling sound. We were alone, and he didn't make the noise. I was so scared, I told him we should stay at my apartment that night. He said it was tied to him, and it would just follow him. When we got to my place, I told my roommate about the situation. She was open-minded about it, and we sat up talking for a while. At one point, he and I went and got into my bed to lie down. He told me he could feel it nearby. My skin started to get goosebumps, and I felt this overwhelming fear. We decided to go back into the living room with my roommate because it felt safer. While they were talking, I decided to go outside on my patio for a smoke to calm myself a bit. I am actually not a superstitious person, so this was all getting to me, plus I hadn't been sleeping much. While I sat outside, there was a lightning storm. There was no rain yet, but I could see the sky flickering, and the wind started to blow back and forth in these big gusts. I stared to feel angry, like, how dare this thing come to my house? In my mind, I challenged the creature to appear, I dared it to. I was calling it out in my head. The storm was coming, and I decided to go back in, feeling upset and angry. I put my cigarette out in a small glass ashtray that was on the patio. As I pushed the butt down, the ashtray split perfectly into 3 pieces. 3 perfect triangles. I know I didn't push hard enough to break it. Right then, the thunder and lightning crashed really hard. I scooped up the broken ashtray pieces and ran back inside to show my boyfriend and roommate. I was so freaked out by everything at that point that I couldn't process it. The next day, he called his aunt in Mexico, and she told him to get a small mirror and look into it while calling out to the spirit. She told him to break the mirror when he saw or felt the demon, and then to bury the pieces where no one would find them. He did it, apparently, and there were no more problems after that. Freaking weird. I'd give it was all nonsense to this day, but I will never ever forget how I felt when that ashtray broke. It was like the bad spirit was taunting me back. When I was about 15, I went to Virginia with my mom and dad to see one of my sisters, who was in the Navy and stationed in Norfolk. She had a baby a few months prior, and we went to meet her. Because we were in Virginia and I was fascinated with history, I wanted to visit the historic towns of Jamestown and Williamsburg. So the second day we were there, we went to Williamsburg. My sister told us about one of the churches where the founding fathers would sit, and I wanted to go in. It was very neat and nicely air-conditioned. After we left the church, there were gravestones that my mom and I went to look at. While we were standing there, probably for about 2 minutes at that point, I started feeling a tightness around my neck. The tightness kept getting stronger, and I was at that point starting to suffocate. I looked at my mom, who looked like the wind was knocked out of her. She eventually manages to push me, and I grab her, and we both manage to break free of whatever it was. After we catch our breaths, she notices I have redness around my neck. When she gets a closer look, she sees a full handprint. She immediately takes a picture and shows me, and it is a handprint, a very large handprint. She proceeds to take a picture with my hand over the handprint, and this handprint is so large I can't match it. After my dad and Bill come over and see me, I have redness around my neck. My dad immediately asks why I have redness on my neck. I tell him, but he doesn't believe me. Not only do I put my hand over the handprint to show him, he does the same, even though his hand is smaller. He of course tells me and my mom nothing happened, and we proceed to leave. My mom takes a quick snapshot of the graveyard before we do. When we look back at the photos later, we notice a silhouette by a tree that was near the gravestone we're looking at. Mind you, this was all in broad daylight. After a few days, we get back home and show my older sister the pictures. She believes us, she was the only one, my brothers weren't. A day after we settled, my mom downloaded the pictures on the computer. The next day, we went to look at all the pictures, but those pictures of my neck in the graveyard were completely gone. My mom's camera at the time held photos for 2 weeks before they were permanently deleted. When we went to look at the photos on her camera, at the point 6 days later, they were also gone. She tried to download the pictures again, but those images were permanently lost. Mom and I only have the memories, but when I tell people, most think it's a made-up ghost story. I can tell you it was real, and I'll never forget it. The story starts out with me exploring the marsh forest behind my childhood home. I was in high school. I took pictures in the woods. There was something weird in the images. I went to sleep that night like normal. I wake up inside my dream, something I have tinkered with a bit. I am vivid, I know it is a dream, and normally I can snap awake, but I was locked into this experience. I was in a room vaguely similar to an uncle's house, and I was lifted off the floor by some demonic force that appeared as a dark, steamy cloud. I was smashed into the walls repeatedly. It hurt. Dreams don't hurt. This SHT freaked me out. I ended up praying and being stuck in a bad place. I finally got out of the mist and tried to hide in a bathroom. The toilet started overflowing with blood, and the sink started oozing blood. The window opens, and moths pour in so thickly that it was hard to breathe. The doorknob was scorching hot. I burned my hand on that. This dream was so beyond my normal realm that I felt like I had died and was stuck in hell or something. I was locked in a bathroom of blood and bashed into the door repeatedly until breaking through. I struggled to get up and then ran out of the house through the room. I get to the road and look back at the house, and those crazy, gold-colored eyes flash brightly. I heard a noise, turn to look, and a ducking demon wolf dog thing sprints up to me and bites my arm. It rips off my arm at the elbow, and I am losing my goddamn mind as I watch this thing trot off with my arm. Meanwhile, I am screaming and trying to stop the bleeding with my shirt, and I tell myself to snap out of it. Poof, I wake up sweating hot and cold with goosebumps head to toe. Something was in my bedroom. Something followed me home. I think I got this thing to go away a while ago. I've had the fortune to travel all across this great and wonderful nation. I've shared about some creepy stuff I've come across during my travels before, but I've seen something while camping that makes me reconsider mountain folk in Georgia. Now I love my home state. I love exploring the vast amount of wilderness we have here. I just happen to carry a gun at all times while exploring now. I didn't then. I went to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a friend to hike. A week without phones, we called it. Except we had his satellite phone in case of emergency. We hike as far as we please and fish as we find water. Of course, we also have a GPS and compass to ensure we don't get lost. So we're on our next to last day of hiking back. We come across a small clearing in a valley that has a nice sized pond. We stop to set up camp and fish. As night falls, our fire fading, bellies full of fish, wild onions, potatoes, and wine, we lay down to sleep. Then I heard it. My friend is fast asleep. The sound doesn't wake him up. There's something outside. Close by, but not distant enough. A moment of stupidity and adrenaline hits me as I grab our machete and exit the tent, brandishing my lackluster weapon. The sound is that of a drum being played with the skill and expertise that only a child with the basic idea of rhythm possesses. Upon exiting the tent, I see a fire and a woman across the pond. Yet she's not creating the drum sound. Instead, she has a black kettle hoisted above her fire, and she's stirring it. She turns her face to me, and I see that she must be as old as the mountains themselves. Her clothes are rags. Yet she has an aura about her. One that is dark and filled with terrible wisdom and knowledge. As her ancient eyes meet mine, I become paralyzed by fear. The drumming grows louder. And then it stops suddenly. And she's gone, as is her fire and any evidence that she existed. I started our fire again and did not sleep. Upon hiking out of the woods and back to our car, we decided to stay at a hotel in a small town nearby since I was exhausted from staying awake. Of course I had told my table to my friend when he woke, and we packed quickly and moved as fast as our legs would carry us. We got to the hotel, which, thankfully, had a restaurant and bar. I showed my table to some locals. The consensus was that I had met a mountain witch whose land I was trespassing on, and we were only alive because I had stayed awake. They may have been jesting, but they seemed very serious. I now carry a firearm whenever I hike. Mostly because it makes me feel safer. Whether you believe my tale or not makes no difference to me, dear listener, but there are dark and ancient things in this world. Stay safe. We were out around midnight with spotlights to look for animals on the Apache reservation. We like to go really deep in the woods because that's where there's the most wildlife. We see packs of wolves, mountain lions, and herds of elk, the whole thing. Every once in a while, we'll turn off the truck and just look up at the stars because they're so amazing. One time, while we were doing this, another truck started barreling down the road behind us. We realized they couldn't see us because our truck was off. So my uncle starts waving and trying to get their attention while everyone else runs out of bed and onto the shoulder of the road. The two Apache men in the other truck noticed when they were about 50 feet away and slammed on their brakes. We were so relieved. We were expecting them to drive around us at this point and be on their way, but that wasn't their plan at all. They just sat there, staring at us. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. We were all frozen. Literally feeling like a deer in the headlights. They sat there for close to 10 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, they turned on their lights. I thought for sure they were about to murder all of us in the middle of nowhere, and nobody would ever know. Then they ever so slowly started to drive around our truck, and they left. Why were they even out there? They weren't looking for animals. There weren't any houses even close by. What were they doing? The house I grew up in, located in a small Belgian town, always had a creepy vibe. My sister and I would feel uneasy being alone upstairs, for example, or when we were downstairs, it sounded like someone was walking around up there, although we knew we were the only ones home. More creepy anecdotes. My sister always hears typing coming from my mom's study, but nobody is in there. And my dad said he often felt the blankets being pulled off of him at night while my mom was fast asleep. One time when she was in the bath, my sister also experienced the radio going on and off by itself. Her boyfriend was with her, and of course it really creeped out. He didn't believe our childhood home was spooky, but after that experience, he did. The creepiest occurrence, though, in my memory was when I was home alone studying downstairs and my parents came home late after a party. They asked me how I got down there so quickly when they had just seen me standing at the upstairs window when they entered the house. My sister wants to be home. My sister also had very intense sleep paralysis experiences that would send her running screaming to my parents' bedroom when she woke up from them. I also had a very intense dream where I was sitting in the bathroom and looking down the hallway, seeing a little girl with long, dark hair slowly coming up the stairs towards me while looking me straight in the eye. I woke up before she reached me, but it still creeps me out thinking about it. The house has some history to it, having been used by German soldiers in the war. My dad found soldier boots, newspaper articles, and old pictures when he was fixing it up. Also, an old woman died while falling down the cellar stairs at one point. I haven't lived there in a long time, but my sister and I still like to reminisce about the spooky things we experienced back then. I found an old-growth forest in the southern Appalachian Mountains. To get there, I had to drive down some old country roads and then take a gravel Forest Service road several miles into the woods. The trail to the virgin forest was unmarked, but I'd read about it in a guidebook as an unmaintained trail that could possibly be overgrown. I hike and camp alone a lot, so going there didn't really bother me. I found the trail and hiked a couple miles to where the guidebook suggested. The trees were immense. It was a completely mature forest of poplars and hemlocks with mossy old fallen logs and giant ferns. Cathedral-like in that it's quiet. I spent some time looking at the trees, some of which were 19 feet around, which is damn big for the area. I decide to set up camp and go off trail down through a laurel thicket, looking for, I don't know what. I'm pretty far away from everything at this point. GPS said there weren't any roads nearby at all, and I could confirm this because of how far I'd driven into the woods to get there. At the bottom of the hill, past the laurel thicket, there was a small pasture in a sort of bowl surrounded by hills and a small creek. There was no sign of anyone except me and the cavernous forest. I set up my tent next to the creek and gathered some firewood. The dusk settles, and I smoke a little and go and lay out in the field to watch the stars come out. Once night has completely fallen, the stars are out fully, and the light from them and my little fire is more than enough to see by. Behind me in some distance is the orange glow of the flames, and the rest of the field glows blue in the starlight. That's when I began to hear a rhythmic drumming over one of the hills surrounding me. It sounds like it's coming from just over a ridge a bit behind me and to the left. I listen for a while and begin to get chills as I realize that this sound is really loud and in dense wood where there shouldn't be anyone. It doesn't get any closer but continues for quite some time. 3 loud bangs followed by silence and then repeating. To me, it sounds like 2 logs being hit together over and over. With nowhere to go in the dark and being relatively safe, I just listened. The banging eventually stopped, and I went to sleep after lying cautiously awake for some time. I was out for a walk early one morning in a forest preserve that's usually pretty empty. I start coming around a corner, and I can see a car that's parked in the grass just outside of a parking lot. I think it's strange, but keep on walking. I'm probably like 50 feet from the car now, and suddenly the trunk pops open, the car alarm starts going off, and the driver's side door opens. I'm coming from the passenger side and can't see the driver, but I get a bad feeling about the situation. I still keep walking on the path and come around where I can see the driver's side of the car. A guy is sitting in the car's driver's seat and starts to wave me over to him. He throws up his hands and says, "I'm not sure what's going on. Could you come help me?" I tell him, "Nah, he's on his own," without breaking my stride, and keep moving. He throws his hands up again, turns off the car alarm, gets out and shuts the trunk, then gets in and drives away. I'm creeped out, so once he's out of sight, I double back and walk the opposite way, just to be safe. I walk back, probably after the 30 minutes it takes to get to the lot where I parked my car. When I'm getting close, I hear that car alarm going off again. I'm freaking out now but don't want to walk back into the woods again, so I keep going to the parking lot. When I get there, that same car is parked with its trunk open, the car alarm going off, and the driver's door open. The guy is already talking to someone else in the parking lot. He sees me come into the lot, looks at me for a minute, then shuts off the car alarm, closes the trunk, and drives away again. I just booked it for my car and called the park rangers, but they didn't believe anything was weird about it. I'm like 90% sure that dude was trying to kidnap someone. To start this off, I must say this takes place in Biloxi, Mississippi, and it happened around September 2018. Me and a friend of mine, whom I will call Jack, were going to hang out around 8 this night. We planned on hanging out and just walking down our street, telling each other how our weeks went. But sadly, there was more than just walking and talking about our weeks. Jack and I began to walk from my house down the street, having a nice conversation about how much we really hated school and how it was just so stressful. We walked to the end of the road, which has 3 ways to go, and all 3 made a loop back to the way we came. We decided to only walk around one of the loops and then head back to a little pound we had to walk past to get to the end of the road. Everything went smoothly. We walked around the loop and were on our way back when I started to have an uneasy feeling. I couldn't figure out what was causing me to feel like this, so I just tried to ignore it. We slowly walked our way up to the pound and began talking about how overgrown the grass had been since no one ever cut it anymore. We then heard a huge splash from down below in the pound. It sounded like someone took a giant rock and just threw it with all their strength. Me and Jack instantly jumped, and both looked at each other. Needless to say, we were on edge at this point. We both kind of just brushed it off, thinking it could have been some kind of animal. We kept talking about nature until I saw something way behind the pound. There was a house, but this house was weird to us because we never understood how people drove to it because, to our knowledge, there are no roads that lead to it. As I looked at the house, I saw a little girl, probably between the ages of 5 and 8, just standing on the porch. It was too dark to see if she was looking at us or something else, but whatever she was looking at, it was creepy. I tapped on Jack and said, "Dude, do you see that girl out there?" He said, "Dude, this is getting too creepy for me. I'm out." I pleaded for him to stay to see what would happen, whether she would go back inside or do something else, possibly worse. He finally agreed, and we started to talk again, And when we did, we got louder and started to laugh. When we did this, I saw her head turn towards something behind her, then back at us. At this point, I was wishing I would have listened to Jack and left. The girl then slowly lifts her arm to point at us. At this point, me and Jack are more scared than we have ever been before. Then the girl starts to sprint full speed towards us. Jack yells run, and so we do. We began to run faster than either of us had run before. We safely made it back to my house and chilled in my room for the rest of the night before he went home. The way that girl was just so silent and how she slowly raised her finger still sends shivers down my back thinking about it today. I don't know what that little girl wanted from us, and I'm just happy we decided to run when we did, because who knows what would have happened had we not run. I have always wondered, did the noise we heard in the pound have something to do with this, or was that just a coincidence? Sometimes I wonder, was that even a girl, or was that something more than a girl? Possibly a ghost or maybe some sort of skinwalker. Whatever it was, I just realized it never hurt us. A few years ago, my brother and I were driving a 15-hour drive overnight across 3 provinces in Canada to meet up with our parents and other family at our grandmother's house. It was summer, and it was raining and flooding a lot of the roads that year, so we had to go off the main route that we would take, the Trans-Canada Highway, and take some more rural roads that we never usually drove on this trip. We've driven it many times. In the middle of Saskatchewan, at about 2 to 3 a.m., we were on a road called the Louis Riel Trail. We had noticed and made some comments to each other about no one being around, and so we were hoping that the roads weren't closed or redirected up ahead again. We both had noticed it just seemed like the road was totally deserted, but it wasn't the main highway, so we thought maybe that was why there was no one else around. As we were going along, we started to notice dead deer on the sides of the road, quite a few. I remember saying something about hoping not to hit one. Then suddenly, we were on a strip of road for a solid 5 to 10 minutes where both sides of the road were absolutely covered in deer. There are literally piles of dead deer. On top of each other, mangled together, eyes open and shining in the headlights. Clearly dead, the way they were piled and twisted up, like backwards necks and feet up in the air, was shit. There were none in the middle of the road, though, none of them splattered like they'd been hit by vehicles, no blood or gore, just hundreds of intact dead deer bodies lining and piling on top of each other on both sides of the road. I remember just staring at them and looking over at the dead piles on the other side of the road on occasion, and one of us saying something about being in between walls of dead deer. It sounds totally ducked up, but my brother remembers it too, feeling like we were in a daze or something. In hindsight, it should have really freaked us out, but I just remember staring at them and seeing their eyes shining, and I remember thinking something like it looked like they were all looking back at me, wondering why there were so many, wondering why no one else was around, but really just not saying anything and just mindlessly driving through for several minutes. It wasn't until after we were past them and there were other vehicles and semi-trucks passing by us again that we sort of snapped out of it and said, "That was really ducked up, what was that?" I had been taking photos of everything that trip, random clouds, cows in the field, my feet on the dashboard, but I didn't think for a second to take a picture of this bizarre road lined with dead deer on both sides because I was like, not thinking properly when it happened for some reason. Me and my brother talk about this often. It bothers us now because we both remember how weird it was. But saying it to other people never seems to justify the absurdity. I don't think people believe it happened, but we both witnessed it and felt the same thing. Growing up, I always heard or saw things in my home. No one ever believed me, so I eventually just thought it was childhood nonsense. I now know my childhood home is very haunted and has so many ghost stories, but this is only one of them. In 2015, my little brother, 10, and I, 21, were home alone for about a week while my parents were in Mexico. One night, we had a movie night in my parents' room. For reference, the bedrooms are all down the same hallway, with my parents' bedroom being the middle bedroom and my brother's room being the one on the right, and also, none of the windows are able to open, FYI. We were about halfway through the movie when we suddenly heard the front door open and slam very hard against the wall. I panicked, automatically closed the bedroom door, and turned off the TV. We heard heavy footsteps that sounded like heavy men's boots enter the foyer and start rummaging through things. I called 911 immediately and put my brother in the closet because this man was rummaging loudly and I could hear him go from the foyer, to the living room, to the dining room, etc. The 911 operator told me to stay in the room, that the police were very close, and to only come out when they said so. As I am on the phone with 911, I hear the steps walk down the hall and go into my brother's room, the bedroom on the right, and start rummaging through things there and moving things in the closet. We can still hear the noises in the room next to us when I suddenly hear the police swing open the front door and yell for the intruder to surrender. When the police finally told us to come out, My brother and I told them to check the bedroom on the right since that's where we had just heard noises. They flipped that room upside down, trying to find someone, but found nothing. They then asked me to check the house and make sure nothing is missing. When I checked the kitchen, most of the cabinets were open, and in the dining room, some of the chairs were pulled out. Although nothing was missing, seeing that scene was freaky because I had not left the kitchen or dining room like that, and for a moment I thought, maybe it was a ghost. I even asked the police to check the basement and attic but didn't find anyone or evidence of a break-in. The front door wasn't even open. I felt like a fool. When my parents found out, they automatically assumed we made these noises up or heard the noises in our heads. About a year later, my mom was home alone, and it happened to her. She was so scared and finally believed us. The same events happened. First, the front door slammed open, then footsteps walked around, rummaging through everything, and finally, the noises stopped in my brother's closet. The break-in has happened at least 4 more times. We had not had a break-in in about 4 years, but last week, my little brother said he was home alone and heard the same break-in. I am only sorry I was not able to be there for him. Last winter, I was driving down the freeway at night, going between the suburbs of a large metropolitan area. So there were plenty of cars around, but it was maybe around midnight or so, and it had been snowing when it isn't always white during winter here. I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder of the freeway with a guy standing next to it clearly in need of some assistance. I saw them as I was driving past, but since it was later at night and it was cold out, I figured I might as well take the next exit, loop around, and see if the guy still needed help. I get there, and it's a middle-aged working-class type of guy standing outside of his pickup. He is wearing blue overalls, is slender, is slightly balding, and puts off what I can only describe as a weird vibe. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was one of those weird gut feelings that you aren't sure why you feel. He says that he has been having car troubles for about 2 hours out of town, that his alternator is shot, and that his battery needs a boost. I've owned a car with a shot alternator and know that when the battery dies, you need to boost it for a little while if you're going to get it running again. I tell him it's no problem, commiserate with him for a minute, pop my hood, and he says he is going to go grab his cables. When he comes back, I notice in his hand that he has some sort of concealed metal object. I have no clue what it was. I saw it for just a brief moment and saw that it wasn't a knife, but that it was metal and a little shorter than the length of his hand. And he was clearly trying to keep it concealed from my view. This all happened so fast, and I'm immediately on high alert. I see it for a split second as he is bringing the cables to me so that I can hook up my battery. I instantly take a step back to put some distance between us and tell him that he can hook up my battery and I'll wait in the car, all the while in instantaneous full fight or flight, getting ready to block an attack if he were to lunge at me. He doesn't, and he starts connecting the cables to my battery as I'm sitting in my car. I start to wonder if I was imagining things as he connects the battery, and we both wait for the battery to charge. Maybe it was just something that was bundled in with the cables that he just had in his hand? Maybe I misread the situation as dangerous? After a few minutes, he goes to start his car, shouts that it isn't working, and then walks back towards my car, where he waits in front of my car. After a few minutes of waiting, he puts his head back under the hood of my car to fiddle with the cables. All the while, I'm, of course, watching him intently to make sure he doesn't come to the car window, because I was still spooked. He shouts some things about how it isn't working and asks me to come out to take a look. I open my window a bit, casually tell him not to worry, and that it's probably just going to take some time. Luckily, I can just barely see my battery in the dark, through the gap under the popped hood of my car and through the windshield directly in front of me. I see him then fiddle with the cables, and I hear him shout again that it isn't working and for me to come out. Then I see him slip out the metal object I had seen earlier and see him touch it to my battery terminal as sparks shoot out from where he touched it. He starts yelling and jumps back, as I immediately jump out of my car and tell him that something came up and that I needed to go now. I honestly don't remember much of what he was trying to say as I cut him off, or exactly what I said. Outside of that, I needed to GTFO without taking my eyes off him for even half a second. I don't even remember how the cables came off my battery. Did I pull them? Were they already off? But I slammed the hood shut, jumped in my car, and drove off. I still have no idea what his plan was. I had no clue what he was trying to do or what on earth he was trying to make happen. But I do know for a fact that what I saw him do is in no way what he was telling me he was doing. But as I left him there and drove off, I was practically pinching myself, trying to make heads or tails of what just happened. And I cannot stress enough that the guy just gave off the weirdest vibes. Like the hills have eyes kind of weird vibes. Maybe he was planning on trying to short my battery so that I was stuck there? But still, to this day, I wonder if I encountered some sort of mass murderer who had been planning on kidnapping somebody at the side of the freeway as they stopped to help. Who knows? But either way, it was weird as duck, right? It spooked me, and I noped the hell away from that dude as fast as was humanly possible. I still wish that I had gotten a license plate or something to give to the cops, but in that moment, the only thing going through my mind was just to remove myself from that situation as fast as was humanly possible. I got married too young, 21, and then divorced when I was 23. A few months went by, and I started having these nightmares. Long story short, a girl in a white dress with brown hair matted with leaves and dirt walks into my house, tracking muddy footprints. She stops and stares at the attic stairs, which are down for some reason. I ask her why she's there, she screams, and the whole house crumbles. I never saw her face. I had this nightmare almost every night for 3 months, and when I say almost every night, I mean probably 95% of the time. For some reason, I started sleeping in my living room as opposed to the bedroom. I just wasn't very comfortable in there. So I'm sleeping on my couch one night and wake up around 2 a.m. for no reason. I check my phone and see I have a text from my friend. I respond, important because it verifies I was awake. I started getting very uncomfortable, and then I heard a knock at my door. I walk around and peek out the window, and there's a girl there. I can't see anything other than her white hoodie, which is up, and long dark hair coming out of it. She knocks, then knocks again. Not urgently or anything, but she didn't appear intent on leaving. So, stupidly, in retrospect, looking back on this as a 34-year-old, I crack open the door. In a quiet voice, she asks if she can use my cell. I still can't really see her face because my porch light was out, and I'd been putting off changing the bulb for no reason at all. I ask if everything's okay, and she just repeats that she needs to use the phone. Again, against my better judgment, I put my cell phone on the dial screen and handed it to her. I see her hit a few things, then out the phone to her ear, and the screen light gave me a better view of her face. She was younger, somewhere between 18 and 22. Plain, not really particularly distinguishing in any way. She waits for a minute, then says, "Hey, I need help." "I need your help." "Yeah. Okay. Then hand me the phone again." So I look at my phone, and it's still on the dial screen. Something felt weird to me, so I clicked over to the recent calls, and she hadn't called anyone. When I looked up, she was gone. Not quite vanished, but like way down the street, farther than anyone should have been able to cover in that time frame, walking away. After that, the nightmares stopped. Potentially related, 2 months later I got a call from a friend late at night, maybe around 10 p.m., who was like, "Hey, wanna come over for a beer?" I wasn't doing anything, so I did. I got back about 1 a.m., and my house had been broken into. Totally trashed, with a bunch of valuables gone. I certainly don't think my friend had anything to do with that, but I do sometimes wonder if that girl was casing my house that night. It's the only correlation I can make between the dream stopping and real-world explanations for that weird experience. The whole thing was just super weird. I was 14 and in the Boy Scouts, and we were on a canoeing trip down the Buffalo River in Arkansas. It was a 6-day trip, and it was just our little crew of about 10 boys and 3 adults. We had not seen anyone outside of our crew for days. We would canoe several miles and pick some random spot to sleep each night. This one night, me and a friend decided we were not going to sleep in the tent. We wanted to sleep in some hammocks by the river. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night being eaten alive by mosquitoes, decided that this was a stupid idea, and began walking to my tent that my tent buddy had set up and was sleeping in without me. The field we chose to camp on that night was quite large, so the tents were spread out very far apart. I am walking by one of the tents, and I see this shape huddled up next to it. I assumed it was the boy's backpack, but it was oddly shaped and could have been a person. It was very dark, and I couldn't see. For some reason, I decided to kick it while I was walking past to make sure it was just a bag. When I kicked it, it grunted in pain. It surprised the SHT out of me. You must understand that we were in the middle of nowhere. I was out in the wilderness, so my first thought was that Adam, the guy who was supposed to be sleeping in that tent, was outside of it for some reason. So I knelt down beside him and asked, "What are you doing out here?" The man replied, "I like you people." That was when my heart nearly exploded out of my chest. This was a stranger. This was not Adam. Fear seized me. I noticed he had a knife in a sheath on his belt loop. I was trying my best to stay calm. I will never understand why I thought that I needed to get that knife away from him. I should have run screaming, but I didn't want to alarm him. I went to grab the knife, and he grabbed my arm and said, "You need to go to bed." I said okay. And got up and walked the remaining 100 or so feet to my tent. I woke up my tent mate, damn near hysterical. I just knew he was going to come in any second and kill us. I woke him up and told him the story, and he, being much braver than me, went out there, walked around, and came back and said he didn't see anyone, and he thought I was making the whole thing up. The next morning, he woke me up and told me the adults wanted to talk to me. I walk out of the tent, and I can see people's SHT just scattered everywhere. Apparently the guy, whoever he was going outside each tent and going through the backpacks looking for stuff to steal, I guess. One of the adults had an expensive camera missing. The adults went and searched for signs that someone else was on this part of the river but never found anyone or anything. To date, that is the scariest moment of my life, and though I am 36 years old and my wife mocks me, I still sleep with a nightlight. I've gone camping tons of times with my Boy Scout group, and when I was younger, I used to wake up pretty much every night in the middle of the night. Having a fear of being alone in the dark, it always took me a long time to get back to sleep. To make things worse, the only way I could get to sleep was if I went to sleep while other people were clearly awake in their tents and talking to each other. That meant that I'd always fall asleep earlier than everyone else, which is probably part of the reason I'd wake up in the middle of the night. Usually, I'd get really freaked out over some noise I'd hear. The tents had optional windows that you could open if you preferred. Since it got really cold at night and I was terrified of opening the windows and looking out into the forest at night, these were always closed. There was no way in hell I was going to unzip the tent flap or the windows and go out there when I heard these noises. One time I had to go to the bathroom and wake up the other kid in my tent before I got out. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of the time I heard animals or the wind, and 99% of the time that's probably what it had turned out to be. One specific time, however, really stuck out to me when I looked back on it in hindsight. I was around 11 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night like I usually do. The other kid in the tent I was with was dead asleep. I'd had problems with the scoutmasters waking up kids while they were sleeping because I got scared before, so usually I'd just bite the bullet and go to sleep. The only time I didn't get in trouble was when I woke up as a kid when there was a fox throwing itself at our tent, and I thought it was a coyote and freaked out. Anyway, I woke up as usual and inevitably started getting scared of being alone in the dark. In these many situations, I just cuddle into my sleeping bag more, pull it over my head, and try to ignore any noises I heard. I was shaking in my sleeping bag when I heard the zipper of another tent across from me being pulled down. A few seconds later, I heard an adult-sounding grunt, and some footsteps crunched past the pine needles in front of my tent and towards the woods. I saw the flashlight briefly run across my tent, too. Actually, this puts me at ease. I figured it was a leader who got up to go to the bathroom in the nearby trees. A few minutes later, footsteps went past my tent from the other direction, and then the zipper again. I relaxed a bit. It felt better knowing there was someone else who was awake with me in the dead of the night. Now, I thought that was the end of it, but a few minutes later, I heard the same zipper again. The footsteps went past my tent, and I figured he might have forgotten something. The footsteps went past my tent, and I heard the zipper again. Now, this is where things got weird. After that, every 10 to 20 seconds or so, I heard footsteps crossing back and forth across my tent, as if someone were pacing back and forth in front of my tent. After the second or third time I heard them, I half yelled hello? Not loud enough to wake the kid next to me, but definitely loud enough to be heard across the small campsite in the silence of the forest. No one answered, and then, around a minute later, I started hearing the footsteps again. They sounded 100% human. It was clearly shoes crushing against the pine needles and dirt. Also, the footsteps didn't seem like anyone was trying to sneak around. The footsteps sounded confident and even spaced, like someone was just walking around in the middle of the night. After I called out to the person and didn't get a response, that's when I started getting freaked out. Eventually, I curled up really far into my sleeping bag and had my eyes squeezed shut. I don't know how long the pacing continued to happen, but after what seemed like forever, it finally stopped. I was still really freaked out, and I didn't get any good sleep at all that night. I eventually opened the door once the sun had come up around 5 a.m. and sat on the floor carving something until others woke up and we could hike out. I don't know why I didn't tell anyone about it. It was probably because I was already made fun of enough for always being the kid to get scared in the night and wake up someone. But seriously, now that I have long passed my Boy Scout camping days, that was the single scariest thing to happen to me on a campout. It wasn't the same person, and if they had a flashlight, they must have been very careful not to point it at my tent, because I definitely didn't see it. I'll never forget it, the day after Easter in 1972. We were off from school. To this day, I have no explanation. When I was 15, my older brother and I were hanging out in the yard. Our dad was a very unique person. We lived in a rural area. To our surprise, we both saw Dad walking up the long driveway to our house. This was around 10 in the morning. We wondered what happened as he left for work in his car around 7. My brother went inside to tell Mom. We were curious. He was wearing the same clothes he wore that morning. It was him, there was no way it could be anyone else, and the closest houses were at least a quarter-mile away. I started to walk out to meet him, and as I was maybe 100 feet away, I called out. The next thing I knew, he wasn't there. I thought he somehow fell for the culvert. Nothing. I searched, and my brother came and also searched. Mom and my sister came out, and we covered the area for maybe half an hour. Nothing. Mom suggested we give Dad a call at work. He answered the phone right away, and Mom, in a light-hearted manner, asked him if he'd been home in the last hour. He worked as a civilian on a military post about 25 miles away. Mom put my brother on the phone, and then me. He denied he'd been home. We again asked him when he came home, and he seemed to be irked. He insisted we were mistaken, and he had no explanation. I remember about 10 years later bringing this up, and he became upset and said I was playing a mind game. I'm the only person in this account who's still alive. To this day, I have no idea what my brother and I experienced. I know it was him. I know he was there, and then he wasn't. I guess it's just one of those things. I currently live in the Midwest of the United States. I'm 24, and my boyfriend and I, let's call him John, live in a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet town. I'm here to share what's been happening for the past few weeks. A couple months ago, I started noticing things either going missing or things not being where I had placed them just moments before. If I were to get ketchup out of the fridge, set it on the counter, and go to the oven to put food on my plate, the ketchup bottle would be gone or moved. Or if I were to plug my cell into the charger, leave the room, and come back a few minutes later, it would be unplugged. For a while, I just let these things happen because I figured it was John playing jokes on me. One particular day, John was in a poor mood and snapped at me to stop moving his things. At first, I thought he was joking, trying to get a rise out of me. I thought he wanted me to call him out on moving my things. I realized he wasn't joking. For weeks, he genuinely thought I was messing with him, and I thought the same. John and I aren't necessarily new to the supernatural or superstition. We've both grown up with strange things happening to us, I guess because we're susceptible people who believe in odd things. So, we thought we had a ghost or a trickster or something, messing with us for its own amusement. It went on like this for a few weeks, maybe a month. We would make jokes here and there about the ghost moving our things. One morning I woke up and did my usual routine to get ready for work, and John asked me if I had woken up at any point through the night. I told him no and asked what was wrong. He told me that he woke up in the early morning hours, maybe 3 or 4, and felt like someone was watching him. Now, in our room, there is no overhead light, so we use lamps, and when we sleep, we shut them off, and we don't keep a TV in the bedroom. So there is no light when we sleep, it's just completely dark. He told me that morning that when he woke up, there was a figure on our ceiling by the bedroom door. He said it either seemed to be floating or it was on the ceiling. As he became more aware and awake, he got frightened, and whatever this being was turned its head to look in the door, and it vanished. John said that it was clear, it was darker than the black of our bedroom, darker than any black he had seen before. While this scared me, I didn't let it get to me, and after a while, I forgot about the whole thing. I forgot about the tricks and the figure, and things started to seem as though they were normal. I couldn't have been more wrong. About 2 weeks after the figure appeared to John, things started moving again. Small things were placed in different parts of our house, knickknacks were moved and even upside down. We lost remotes, keys, cell phones, and shoes that were misplaced. Even my glasses were found on top of the refrigerator in the kitchen after I put them on my bedside table before bed. I was starting to get angry. I tried smudging our house, blessing candles, and burning incense. I thought I was doing what I could to get rid of this trickster spirit. A little over a month ago, John and I were watching a movie. We have 2 cats, and we were laying in bed, kind of watching the movie and kind of on our phones. Everything was normal until we both saw the same shadow figure walk by our closet. Instantly, he grabbed my hand, and I knew he had seen it too. We just stayed there for what felt like hours, but it was only seconds before we realized whatever it was there wasn't going to be seen again. While we were talking about what we had just seen, one of our cats started acting very strange. He kept looking into our room, running down the hallway, and staring into our room. He was in a defensive pose, his tail puffed up, and he was obviously frightened or mad. At this point, I was crying and telling John to turn on all of the lights in the house. After we did, our cat started relaxing and going back to his normal self. About an hour later, we stopped walking around the house and got comfortable again, so John turned off the lights. Our cat, once again, was not happy about something in our bedroom. We tried pushing him into our room, but he was fighting with us like he was frightened. After a while, he calmed down and was relaxing on our bed, helping us to relax. Things around our house have started feeling darker. Pictures are being knocked over, and we'll come home to broken candle holders on the floor. Which could be our cats, but our cats have never broken anything or knocked glass off of the counters. But we're not ruling them out as a possibility. The energy is just feeling a bit darker, which is why I'm telling this story. About 3 weeks ago, I woke up in the middle of the night. I instantly remembered the story that John had told me about seeing the figure, so I got scared and tried to go back to sleep. As I was rolling over, I made the mistake of opening my eyes to look around. In the corner of our bedroom, behind the slightly closed door, stood a figure about 6 feet tall. This figure was as black as night, almost radiating darkness. I lost my breath and froze, mid-roll, and watched as this thing protruded heavy black wings from its back and disappeared into the darkness of my hallway. I could feel the tears in my eyes as I started to catch my breath and wake up. "John." I told John what I had just seen, and he got up to turn the lights on. I cried as I hysterically told him about the figure with the wings. And to my horror, he told me that when he had seen the figure, he saw wings too. He left that part out because he couldn't even believe it himself. Needless to say, we didn't end up going back to sleep that night. It's been 3 weeks since I've seen this dark figure. Objects in our house have stopped moving, and everything seems to be going back to normal. John and I have been researching, and what we think we both saw is a dark fairy of some sort. Some humanoid creature with wings, radiating dark energy, and playing tricks on humans. We're going to continue researching whatever this could be and how to get rid of it. Hopefully, it's had its fun and is gone. I'd feel much safer knowing that, whatever this creature is, it isn't watching us while we're sleeping. I'm a hunter up here in Minnesota, in a town not far north of Mille Lacs Lake. I have a handful of creepy stories detailing freaky incidents that have taken place on hunts. Here's the first. One season in particular, I was fairly deep in the woods on a snowmobile trail. When I hunt, I typically carry my .32-06 knife and pack. I feel fairly confident in the woods, but this season I had some concern. The deer population seemed lower on our property recently, and we knew there were wolves around because you could find their tracks, not to mention being able to hear them howl at night. But luckily, they typically don't mess with people, but as I was scanning for deer tracks in the dirt, I found a different set of tracks that stood out to me. They looked canine minus the nail marks and were a bit wider. The paw on it looked like a 150-pound animal. Then it clicked that this was a feline track, a big one, and fairly fresh. I knew there were bobcats around, but they don't get that big, so the next logical step is to assume that there was a cougar in the area. I decided to double back. So I'm heading back east on the trail when my dad calls and asks me to do a push through the woods towards his stand, so I say sure. At this point, his stand is maybe 500 meters through thick woods from me, and I'm concerned about the large predator nearby, but I also know that I'm 6 feet 4 inches and about 190 pounds before putting on my gear. Statistically speaking, cougars don't tend to attack healthy adult men. So I push forward. I get about halfway to the other stand when I get concerned because I lost my marker. I stop to regain my bearings, and then it hits me. Something in my gut tells me, you are being watched. Then I notice how still the woods are, deathly quiet. Then I hear a branch snap behind me by maybe 20 meters. I ready my rifle and scan in a circle, but I only see trees and brush. I wait, and it's just way too quiet, so I push forward towards my dad's stand. The whole time, I hear something not far behind me that's quietly keeping pace. Eventually I stopped hearing it, and the woods went back to normal with the birds singing and whatnot. Then I stepped out onto a trail, about 40 meters from my dad's stand. I suspect it was the cougar that made the tracks. My guess is that it thought I would put up too much of a fight or that it caught my dad's scent and chose to back off. I never did see it, but something definitely was following me. Second story, this happened like 2 years ago now. I decided to take my fiancée hiking after work one evening in a park with some nice bluffs to climb for a great view. If I'm honest, I was hoping to see a nice sunset and earn some boyfriend points so I could drink with my buddies on the weekend without complaint. You should know that this isn't a particularly safe thing to do at this time of night, so I gave her my tactical knife and carried a .40 caliber pistol. We arrive and park the car before heading up a trail, and then about 100 meters in, we spook what I assumed was a deer, which hauled ass away from us so quickly that I only saw a flash of tan. Honestly, it scared us pretty good too, so now I'm on edge and we round a crest in a hill, and I see a black mass to my left in peripheral vision. I unsnap the retention on my holster and turn to engage what turned out to be nothing but a mound of black dirt. So I calm down, and we continue on with our nice little evening hike, with birds chirping, bugs making noise, and regular forest stuff. Now for the creepy part. Once we're within about 200 meters of the halfway point on the trail, it starts to feel really eerie, almost like we are being watched. This time it clicked right away. The woods are now dead, but I start noticing movement keeping pace with us, so I keep us moving towards the top of the hill, the high ground, which is the halfway point on the trail. We reach it and stop, so does whatever was following us, but the woods are still dead calm, and my fiancée tells me she thinks we are being followed, so we decide to move on and take a short cut back down the bluff to the paved trail. We make it, and the woods get back to normal sounds again. We considered hiking more, but were a bit too spooked and left the park. Now whatever was following us, I suspect, was another cougar. It was quiet and we didn't see it, and the strangest part is that the stalking noises it did make sounded elevated, like it was moving from tree to tree, and big cats have been known to do this. Story 3 is perhaps the least explainable of them. This one happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and much more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer and knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin, or at least by the bonfire by the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was that if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy, that is, until this incident. This happened in broad daylight, sometime around noon. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo, he was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters up the trail. We had enough at this point and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds, but it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs, crouching next to a tree with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. The next thing I know, we're both sprinting back towards our cabin. I look back at the wolf or bear thing, which was now in the process of fully charging us, barreling through the brush. But for whatever reason, it stopped following as we broke out of the tree line. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. The wolf thing had to be nearly 7 tall when upright, and where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now I'm not sure how to explain it rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more often waddle on their hind legs. I still have no idea, to this day, exactly what that thing was. I love all things spooky, and as a photographer, urban decay interests me a lot as a photo subject. I got overnight tickets, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., to tour an abandoned insane asylum. It was open to the public for tours, history lessons, and whatnot. The place was basically abandoned overnight, had a history of violent patients, overcrowding 3 times their intended capacity, and malpractice. All the way back to when it started as a care clinic for the Civil War. It was partially renovated to follow safety guidelines, like old stairs and caving flooring, but the owners were set on preserving as much of the building as possible, from the furniture and doors to the faded nameplates on some rooms and half-erased chalkboards. I'd like to preface that before this, I didn't really believe in ghosts but respected others' opinions. This night changed that. We were encouraged to do some exploring after the first half of the tour. The place has 4 floors with multiple wards, so a lot of walking was anticipated, and I distinctly remember everyone wearing sneakers or athletic shoes, even the guide. You know, usually quiet with rubber soles. After the group split up to explore, I ventured into a ward with a heavy, screechy, loud as shit steel door to take some photos of the previously mentioned chalkboards and stuff. The only way in and out of the ward was through that door. The end of the ward was the end of the wing. It was dead silent. As I stepped into a cell room to take photos, I heard the crisp, echoing sound of boots walking on the hardwood flooring from the hall. The sound was making its way towards me at a slightly slower than normal walking pace, in the direction of the heavy door. I don't think I've ever been so frozen in fear in my life. The ward was empty of my fellow tourists. I checked each room when I made my way to the end, and I had no idea who could be in there with me. After about 7 seconds, the sound abruptly stopped midway down the hall, and I peeked my head out of the room. No one was there. After calming down and not pissing myself, I searched every room in that damn ward. Not a soul was in sight. No screeching or thudding came from the door. There's absolutely no way anyone came in or out. I'm convinced the ghost of an old resident doctor or a guard haunts those halls, slowing paces up and down. This is the story of the first time I saw a werewolf. It happened to me when I was a little boy. About 8 to 11 years old. I lived in Estonia, and I still do. Me, my stepfather, mother, older sister, younger brother, and our dog went to our summer home. It was a very old house that my parents had bought. We wanted new windows for it because it didn't have any. So one night, me and my sister wanted to sleep in a tent. So our stepfather set up the tent, and we spent the night there. I was a little nervous because I had heard that in the forest near our house there are bears. But my mother said that babies don't come close to humans. And she was right. What I saw wasn't a bear. At around midnight, when my sister was sleeping, I had to pee. And so I got out and walked pretty far from the house to do my business. When I finished, I heard a howl and a screeching mixture. I looked around but didn't see anything. I thought it was in my head because I really like werewolves and wolves, but there were no wolves in our forest. Not that I would know, but I had asked my mother. But I felt like something or someone was staring at me. I started to walk back to the tent when I heard a scream that still haunts me. It was the scream of a dog, but it sounded like it was drowning. A few minutes ago, I heard a squirrel in the bushes. I looked at the big bush near me. She was 50 feet away and saw an animal with red, yellow, clawing eyes who was looking at me. I thought it was a neighbor's dog, but they lived a few miles away, and the dog isn't as big as it was. So I was startled because my second thought was a bear, and I didn't move because I knew when you meet a wild animal, you can't turn your back on it, so you had to walk slowly backwards. But when I tried, I wounded my foot, and that thing growled at me loudly. So I couldn't walk away because I was too afraid to know that it wasn't a bear. Because bears don't growl like that. I stood there, the thing staring at me. And I started to smell a rotten stink mixture with blood. It growled at me again, which scared me even more. A few months ago, witches felt like housewives, but then something happened that I could only dream of. The thing stood on its back legs, and I saw what it looked like. Like I said, I was a big fan of werewolves, but I didn't think I would meet one. It was about 8.5 feet tall, with red and yellow eyes, cowering in fur. The upper body had longer fur than the lower body, and it looked like a man, but it was bigger, had a tail, and had a wolf's or a German shepherd's head. That thing gave me a few more minutes and came closer. It had black claws and brown fur, and it sniffed me really close, like 5 feet away, and then stopped. It showed me its teeth by opening its mouth, and then I saw how its teeth were coated in blood. I think it saw how scared I was because I was crying a little. Then it turned around and walked into the forest. But before it went in, it turned around and looked at me, as if I were still watching. It howled and ran into the forest. When it was time, I finally got my body to move, and I walked to my tent. With my heart bounding in my chest. When I finally got in, I felt tears going down my face. I kept thinking about it and couldn't believe what I saw, so I fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I wasn't sure if that was real or if it was all a dream. It felt so real, and that night there was a full moon. When I checked my foot, I saw a wound that I got last night, and I believed it was real. I haven't told anyone this story. I don't like when people say that I'll make stuff up. Like with my other stories. But I saw it for real. I'm now older, and after seeing the videos of true werewolf encounters, I believe I really saw a werewolf. But I haven't seen any more of them. But who knows? Maybe I'll see one in the future. I work in the evenings, and I have always been a night person. I tend to go to sleep in the morning, wake up in the late afternoon, work in the evening, and stay up all night until the sun comes up, then repeat the process. When I lived in the big city of Charlotte, North Carolina, I always liked to visit the 24-hour Walmart Supercenter at night because I just always love the nighttime. It's quiet, traffic is down, and long lines are non-existent. I'm a 27-year-old male, so I never had any problems going out late at night alone in any city. I could handle myself. Due to the fact that I recently relocated for family purposes and currently live in a small town in North Carolina, hardly any stores other than the 24-hour gas stations are open after 10:30 p.m. Because of this, during the late night, I developed the habit of driving to the nearby bigger city and visiting the Walmart neighborhood market, which is a grocery store version of Walmart. This Walmart is open 24 hours a day and is only 12 miles away from home. Many different ways exist to get to the city. I can take the expressway, which would turn into a main highway upon entering the city and take me directly to Walmart, but that's boring. I could take a main highway that isn't an expressway, but that would be a longer trip, and I prefer late night trips to Walmart, not exactly longer trips to Walmart. Lastly, I could take the final route, which is through town using dark country back roads. Of course, being a night person and the horror fanatic I am, I always opt to choose the dark country back road strictly for the thrill. One particular back road is said to be haunted. My grandma once told me that, during the late night, many people recalled seeing ghosts on this road, and she always hated riding down this street, especially at night. Ever since my grandma told me that, every time I decided to go to Walmart late, I always made it a point to take this road in hopes of seeing something weird, scary, or supernatural. During most of my trips, despite the road being creepy, I have never seen anything out of the ordinary, much to my dismay. However, not too long ago, that would all change. One night, possibly about a month or so from today, around 3 a.m., I decided that I wanted to buy a few snacks and some things that the local gas stations didn't sell, such as milk, cereal, and whatnot, so I hopped in the car and headed for Walmart. On the way, I turned on the same road said to be haunted for the thrill again. To describe this road, it is completely dark and quiet, with no streetlights whatsoever. Hardly any cars travel on this road, even during the day. Much of it is a narrow country road with tall woods surrounding both sides of the road, leaving no room for any light source. Save your own headlights. If you turn off your headlights for just a second, which I have done again for the thrill, you will literally be driving in pitch black darkness. While I drove on this road, I turned on my high beams and drove a bit slower than the speed limit in hopes of finding something creepy. When I thought I did see something, it was usually just an opossum crossing the street, a raccoon, or a deer staring at the car from the side of the road. Although it can barely be seen at night, the left side of the road in the woods is mostly swampy, where many of the trees grow out of the water. While I was driving about halfway through this road, I noticed what appeared to be a woman running from the swamp side of the woods. Even though I really could not make out her face in the darkness, she looked to be in her early to mid-20s or so. She wore a visor on her head, a pink athletic shirt with no sleeves, and some black track shorts with long black socks and running shoes. She looked like your typical young female jogger that you see running in the morning, but you know, the jogger that you see running in the morning when the sun is up, and not around 3 o'clock in the morning on dark, creepy roads. As I looked in the rearview mirror to verify that I saw what I thought I saw, the girl was behind my car and sprinting full speed towards it. Believe me when I say that it took me by surprise and scared the living heck out of me. The moment I noticed this, I sped down the road as fast as I could. Perhaps the creepiest part of this whole ordeal was that, when I looked back in the rearview mirror again, she was running back into the swamp woods where she came from. I finally reached the end of the road, shaken. Throughout the rest of the ride, I was constantly asking myself if that girl was likely playing a prank on me. However, I thought that was unlikely for a few reasons. For one, even though the road does have some houses on it, they're spaced out pretty far and farther down the road in the area where I saw her. It wouldn't make sense for a girl who lived in the area to be on that part of the road. 2. Even if she was, I don't know what kind of girl would want to go out in the dark woods at 3 a.m. in the swamp area in the first place. She would be scared, likely putting herself in danger from all the possible dangerous animals that could be in that swamp. 3. If she was intending to scare people, why would she choose a road that is nearly deserted and hardly any cars travel on? Maybe this girl was crazy and had no problem doing any of that. I also thought that maybe this girl was one of the ghosts that supposedly haunted that street. Perhaps she was a ghost of a jogger who could have gotten run over on that street. Either way, no matter who or what she was, ghost or no ghost, I do wonder what she would have attempted if she actually caught up with my car. Regardless, despite that encounter, I still travel on that same road whenever I go to Walmart at night and haven't seen anything like that ever since. I'm a 23-year-old girl from a big city in the Netherlands, Europe. But last year, I moved to a small town in Belgium to pursue my master's degree. The move was pretty rough for me. I went from living in a metropolitan, busy, and lively city to a quiet and sleepy town where everything closes after 6 p.m. Since I'm from a big city, I know how to take care of myself in some unfortunate situations, such as being harassed by creepy people on the streets and having to bike home late at night. This is why I never felt any sense of unsafety in this new town that I moved to. My logic was, since there is almost nobody here, nothing will happen to me. I survived my hometown easily, so why would this small town be any different? Well, a few weeks ago, I would find out how wrong I actually was with that thought. Everything in this Belgian town is about a 5-minute bike ride away from each other. This included my boyfriend's place. One night, around 1:30 a.m., he asked me if I wanted to stay over, but since he had drunk some beers, he wouldn't be able to take his car and come pick me up. I replied that I didn't mind and would just walk over there. Any other night, I would have just taken my bike, but since I borrowed it from a roommate, I wasn't able to. So, I packed my stuff and left for the 15-minute walk. As I was leaving my street, I noticed how incredibly quiet it was in this town. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I just shrugged it off as not being used to the silence. To calm my nerves, I decided to listen to a podcast on my headphones while I continued my walk. I sped up a bit, and as I was about 3 minutes away from my boyfriend's house, I was crossing a large square in the town center. Suddenly, in the back of my mind, I thought I detected a soft whistling. I slowed down my pace and concentrated. There it was again. Was it just a sound in the podcast? I took off my headphones and heard the whistling again, but louder this time. It was a slow, sad melody that I didn't recognize, but it made me feel very uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I wanted to book it out of there. After taking a few more steps, I discovered where the whistling was coming from. From the dark, I saw a male figure emerging, slowly walking towards me. He was whistling his sad tunes as he casually looked around him. This was super odd, as this was a sleepy-ass town where there was nothing to be seen, especially not at 1:30 a.m., when there wasn't any shop or bar opened. There weren't even that many streetlights, so a casual walk around town wouldn't make any sense. His loud whistling carried around the square and made me crave the previous, ominous silence. This man didn't acknowledge my presence, even though we were probably the only humans on the streets in that town at that time. This fact creeped me out even more. No nod, no smile, not even a straight look. He kept whistling his creepy tune and making his way towards me at a faster pace. This is when the creepiest part happened. He encountered a set of bikes that were free to use for anyone in the town. These bikes were never locked, so people could get on them easily, and he was checking a bike out to see if he could take it. I, however, had seen enough. If this man got on a bike, he would get to me in about 20 seconds. I frantically called my boyfriend, but of course, he was drinking and not minding his phone. I took one last look at the man, only to see him get on a bike and look me dead in the face. He conjured up the most horrifying, toothy grin of his life as he started to bike towards me. I screamed, started running, and got to my boyfriend's house in about 1 minute. I frantically knocked on the door and screamed for him and his friends to open up, while I was looking behind me to see if the man got any closer. I didn't see him. They let me in, and I closed the door. I was freaked out of my mind as I started telling them about what just happened. My boyfriend wanted to go out and hunt him down at once, but I begged him not to. The grin on this man's face told me that this wasn't a regular creep, and I didn't want my boyfriend to get hurt. I do not know what would have happened to me if my boyfriend's place wasn't that close. Luckily, I never saw the man again, but I have learned my lesson. A small and sleepy town can be 20 times scarier than a big, noisy city. I used to think Ouija boards were a load of shit. I still kind of do. I really don't know how I feel about them anymore, actually. I always saw them as a party game for gullible people. So when my friend Joe, not a real name for privacy, told me that he had one, I just laughed it off. I had only known Joe for about a year or so, meeting through mutual friends. He lived in a small apartment with his girlfriend Lisa, not his real name, and their dog Vincent. At the time, I was only 18. Joe was like 23 and Lisa was 20. For a period of time, I used to go over to their place every weekend after work because Joe bought me alcohol. So one night we were hanging out, and Joe started talking about some weird encounters he had growing up and how he attracted spirits his whole life or some garbage. I smiled and nodded to be polite while he went off on paranormal tangents and talked about shadow people following him. He then goes into his room and pulls out a Ouija board. But not the one you get at a store made by a toy company. It was made of real wood and hand-carved. It was actually pretty nice. He said he had gotten it as a birthday gift from his parents years ago because he was obsessed with the paranormal. I didn't inquire as to where or who made it, but it looked handmade. While I sat there laughing and joking about it, Lisa chimes in and says, "Joe, tell him about the other night." Joe proceeds to tell me how he and Lisa allegedly spoke to a demon using it, and the demon claimed his name was Beelzebub, a demon in hell. Being a big metalhead at the time, he got my attention. "Let's do it. Let's try to talk to this demon." I was half joking. Joe asked if I was sure I wanted to try it, and I agreed. So we went into his room. We turned off all the lights in the apartment. Lisa lit candles all around the room, and we sat on the floor. I was nervous, but I was having fun watching Lisa and Joe's pageantry. It was spooky. I looked over at Joe, and he seemed unsettled. I asked what was wrong, and he said he wasn't feeling right. He didn't like the doors open, displaying the darker areas of the apartment. He and I got up and closed every door in the place. Every room and every closet door. We sat back on the floor, and Vincent, the pup, laid on the bed. And we began. And I forgot to add that this is very important. Before we started, I told Joe that I was skeptical of someone using their fingers to push the planchette around. So we all agreed to just use the back of our fingernails to touch it. Imagine just slightly bending your finger and placing the surface of your nail on top. That's what we did. That way, even if you added pressure, your finger just slipped around on the planchette and didn't actually move it. We also made a rule that if the planchette moves, everyone has to lightly scratch the planchette with their nail to prove that none of us were moving it. What it looked similar to was placing your two fingers on a table and acting like their legs were running in place. I hope that helps you get the picture. No one was able to move it on their own this way. We tried several times to ask if there were spirits with us. Nothing. For about 20 minutes, nothing. Then I told Joe I wanted to ask for someone in particular. Is John Smith here with us? Can John Smith talk to me? John Smith, obviously not his real name, was the name of one of my best friends, who was killed in a car crash while driving home from a fishing trip. Then it moved. And it was ducking insane. It felt like a great force just came to life in the planchette. Like it had a mind of its own. None of that gliding around the board crap you see in movies. This thing felt like we were holding onto a person's hand who was tugging and pulling. It was a strong but articulate movement. And it spelled out hello. I asked him if he was John, and he said yes. I asked him to prove it. And it spelled out the name of my best friend. I asked him where he was when he passed, and he spelled Lake. I had chills down my spine. What I thought was going to be fun turned into something emotional and scary. Joe and Lisa knew nothing about John Smith. I never mentioned him or brought up anything about the circumstances with them. So they could not have known. I started to grow very unsettled. I told Joe and Lisa I didn't want to talk to John anymore, so they told me to push the planchette to goodbye or whatever it was. I called it a night after that. But I wanted more. The next night, I was back. Same routine, Joe and Lisa set up the room. Joe closed all the doors. Vincent on the bed. Lisa said she wanted to talk to her grandma. So we did the process. Same incident for her as mine. Memory is kind of fuzzy, but it spelled out I love you and also spelled out some sort of inside joke she used to share with her grandma. Lisa was in tears. As with me, I had no information on her grandma, and Joe wasn't that cruel to make her cry as a joke. I felt powerful. I think we all did. I felt like I was finally a believer. We had an actual way of talking to spirits. The possibilities. But then it happened. After the incident with Lisa's grandma, we were all kind of in shock. Joe was comforting Lisa, and I was speechless. We regained our composure and got back to it. This time asking the normal, is there any spirit with us? What usually left the planchette lifeless suddenly kicked in with great force. Scary force. The planchettes moved violently around the board. We all kind of laughed nervously. We asked, who are you? The planchette shot to the moon symbol. If you don't know, this allegedly means a dark spirit. We all looked at each other, then simultaneously moved the planchette to goodbye. As soon as we did, Vincent jumped up and ran off the bed. He sat down in front of the closet door, which was now open. He sat and stared as if looking at someone. We had that door closed before. Joe jumped up, said, duck this, and ran into the kitchen. Lisa and I followed. Joe nearly had a panic attack. He rushed to turn on all the lights. I've never seen Joe panic like that. We were all pretty scared. We don't know what happened, but we had that door closed for sure. After some talking and calming each other down, I left. I didn't sleep that night. I had never seen anything like that. After that night, I felt like I was being followed constantly. For almost a year, I slept with the lights on. That year ended up being one of the worst years of my life. I fell into a depression and was paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching me. I continued to go to Joe and Lisa's place occasionally, but we never touched the board again. We ended up having a falling out some months later over unrelated drama and never communicating after that. Like I said, that year was horrible for me. I started drinking a lot and tried to get over the feeling. I always felt like my energy level was sapped. The air was heavy, and I struggled to find joy. The depression was real. Then the experience hit a peak. I was sleeping one night and woke up in a panic. I couldn't breathe. I felt like someone was literally sitting on my chest. I gasped for air. Suddenly, I felt what felt like someone grabbing my feet and trying to pull me off my bed. I instantly went into a struggle, trying to kick as hard as I could. Then, all at once, it stopped. I was horrified. Nobody was in my room. I lost even more sleep after that incident. I ended up finally getting a hold of my life. I started going to the gym instead of drinking and wallowing in my pity. I started meditating instead of playing video games. After that year, it all went away. It was like I was free from that negative energy again. I've been fine ever since. And that's the story of my Ouija board experience. I'm sorry it was long, probably boring, and overly detailed in random parts. I was just trying to paint the picture for you all. I'm still not sure if all of it was in my head or if that night was just some sort of stress-induced panic attack, but whatever it was, I can't explain it. People have told me demons thrive off your energy, and that's what might have happened, but I'm not sure. Perhaps it was the demon talking to us all along? Pretending to be our loved ones? If such a thing exists, I'm just glad that whole experience is in my past. I'll never touch a Ouija board again, though. So this happened back in the summer of 2017 in Port Orchard, Washington, and I was just chilling with my friends at the local park in our city. This park was a pretty popular park, and lots of people go there, but seeing as this was Washington and it was raining and there was a huge storm, nobody was there except for my friends, so it was getting pretty late, and we decided to go to my house. When we got there, nobody was home, and it was really quiet. I didn't really take note of how quiet it was because when we went inside, we were being really loud, but usually the house is never that quiet. Anyway, me and my friends sit on the couch and start playing Xbox. We played for about 4 hours, and in that time the storm had gotten progressively worse, but we didn't think much of it. As I said before, this was Washington, but we were about to play a different game when I heard a noise come from somewhere around the house. I didn't think much of it, but then I heard it again, only this time much more distinct. It sounded like a metal chair dragging on a floor, but it came from the basement. That's when I asked my friends if they heard it, and they said no, so I put it off as me imagining things because I was tired. That was when I heard it again, but this time my friends heard it, and we all paused and waited for it to happen again. When it did, though it was way louder and way more fierce as it happened, the power went out, and we started to flip out. We were about to pull out our phones, but we couldn't see because it was pitch black. Then I remembered that I had a flashlight hiding under my living room table, so I felt my way back to it and grabbed the flashlight, and I shined it around and realized that one of my friends was gone. I asked the others if they had seen him, and they said no, so after a couple of minutes of searching for him, we heard him say, "Guys, this isn't funny," but it was very faint, and we were upstairs at this time, so we went downstairs and yelled for him, and he responded from the basement. That was when we all looked at each other and realized one of us had to go down there and find him. After minutes of arguing, we all decided we would go down there together. When we got to the top of the basement, we felt the freezing cold breeze, which sent shivers down all our spines, but we sucked it up and started our descent into the basement. We yelled for our missing friend, and he said yes. Now, before we go any further, my basement was huge, and it was divided into 3 different sections. That's when we all looked at each other and realized one is this really small but long hallway to the next part, which is similar to the first section. Once we got to the bottom of the stairs, it was below freezing, but we kept moving. We searched the whole first section, but he didn't turn up, so we looked down the hallway, called for him, and he said, "I'm in here," so we walked slowly through the hallway, and after what felt like hours of walking down this hallway slowly, we made it to the final part of the basement. Which was the longest and the creepiest, but it was so long when we shined the flashlight into it, it didn't hit a wall, but anyways, we yelled for our friend again, and he answered, but it sounded more deep and deeper than his voice actually sounded, but we brushed it off and started going into the last section. We all got out of the hallway and started searching, and we got to the end of the last section where there were a ton of boxes. We shined the light on the boxes and started going towards them. This is when we heard our friend, or at least what we thought was our friend, say in only what I can describe as demonic pure evil and more than scary shriek. I heard one of my friends run away back up the stairs, and me and the last friend that was with me looked and got close to the boxes. That's when I saw horns, and I stopped, but they raised up more and more till I saw the whole body crouching, so it didn't hit the roof of my basement. It was easily taller than the basement roof. That was when my other friend ran. I wanted to, but felt stuck. It locked eyes with me, and I felt like it was staring me down and taking my soul. Then, as my friend came back and grabbed me, the thing shrieked, and it was hella loud. If it went any higher, it could have broken windows. As we were running back up the stairs, we heard stomping huge steps, and we got to the top of the stairs, and it went quiet. My other friends were getting their stuff packed up to leave. I asked if I could stay with them, and they said sure, so I went into my room to grab my stuff, and I went into the living room. By that point, my other friends were in their cars waiting, and I heard from the basement a deep demonic voice. "See you next time." Then I grabbed my charger from the wall and left. I didn't even lock the door when I woke up in the morning. I called my friend that we all went looking for, and he said that he went home shortly after the power went out, and we all flipped out. Let's just say we never went into that basement again, and I moved shortly after to an apartment, hoping I would never see that thing, whatever it was, ever again.